Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take a complex stack of sources and really just drill down to the essential, actionable insights you need right now. We're all about turning dense information into immediate clarity. Okay, so let's unpack this one. We are diving into, I think, one of the most fundamentally provocative ideas about personal agency and, frankly, stress management that we've come across. What if that feeling you have, that debilitating feeling of constantly fighting upstream, that internal sense of losing the race or falling hopelessly behind your peers, what if it has absolutely nothing to do with external objective facts? I mean, what if the path you are walking is factually the same as everyone else's, but your experience of that path is fundamentally, and this is the key, optionally broken? The source material we're working with today is, well, it's incredibly concise, but it's brilliant. It uses a single, simple visual metaphor, just two people moving along the same path, to illustrate a really profound psychological truth.
It argues that the entire difference, and I mean the entire difference, between a life of crushing anxiety and exhaustion and a life driven by trust and sustainable momentum is purely a matter of internal narrative. It's an intellectual shortcut that shows us exactly where our psychological leverage is.
And that point of leverage, that narrative choice, is absolutely the mission of this deep dive. The source material, it lays out this conceptual experiment. It shows, almost mathematically, how two vastly different emotional and psychological realities can be generated from one perfectly identical physical trajectory. So our job today is to move past the simple story of these two travelers and really extract the actual mechanisms at play, what the source calls the rendering loops.
It's rendering loops.
Yeah. Think of it like we're reverse engineering your internal operating system. Your psyche is constantly interpreting vast amounts of, well, neutral data steps taken, time passed, distance covered. What we want to do is understand the code or the filter that the brain runs to interpret those neutral data points.
Right.
And when we isolate that mechanism, that rendering loop, that's where we gain true immediate leverage over our emotional lives. We're not just, talking about abstract perception. We're getting immediate insight into how our system locks us into anxiety or, alternatively, frees us into sustainable cooperation.
And it does all this while the external world remains perfectly constant.
Perfectly constant. That's the critical part.
And, that distinction, the external world remaining constant, I think that's the hardest part for the mind to accept because the feeling of being behind is so visceral. So let's start there. Let's really lock down the objective truth. So let's set the scene for this core visual metaphor. It's really elegant, it's simple, and it has to, absolutely must, establish the constant baseline against which all of this interpretation is measured. We have two figures, let's call them Traveler A and Traveler B, and they are traveling along the exact same path. One trail, one timeline, one set of physical parameters.
And the source is, it's almost painfully rigorous about establishing this baseline. We have to understand the objective physical reality they both share. If we were to measure them with scientific instruments, the data would be identical. It has to be.
Identical across both potential realities we're going to talk about.
Exactly. So the path is identical. No, unforeseen obstacles for one person and not the other. No smoother surface. The total distance covered is identical.
But the effort is identical.
The rate of forward motion, when you measure the effort expended over a period of time, is also identical.
So if you're looking at a GPS tracker, their activity logs would look indistinguishable. Nothing physical changes between the two scenarios we are about to explore. That is the non-negotiable premise here.
It is. It's the essential variable we have to eliminate. Because if any external factor changed, if Traveler A's path was steeper or Traveler B was just genetically faster,
then the whole thing is pointless.
Exactly. The conclusion would be obvious and, frankly, trivial. The physical world caused the difference. But here, the external physics are locked down completely. The external world is only providing neutral data points.
Like?
Traveler A is at coordinate x at time t. Traveler B is at coordinate y at time t. That distance, x minus y, that's the only objective input the system gets.
And the genius of this metaphor is that it uses a repetitive sequence of events to generate that neutral distance over and over again. It makes that choice, the interpretation choice, necessary again and again. This sequence of action is constant. There are 6 specific steps that just run on a loop, regardless of how the travelers feel about it.
Let's detail that shared action sequence, because it's the engine that generates the relative motion, which is what the internal narrative then gets to warp. So step 1, they begin together, they walk side by side for a while, making equal, easy progress. This establishes a state of, let's call it effortless synchronicity.
Okay, then step 2. One person, let's just stick with traveler A for consistency stops to rest. Maybe they feel they've hit a comfortable milestone, or maybe their body just needs to recover. In the real world, this could be anything. Taking a sabbatical, pausing a business venture, taking time off for family.
Right. And then step 3, they fall asleep, or at least rest deeply. This is a period of unconscious, necessary recovery. And crucially, while Traveler A is resting, Traveler B keeps moving steadily forward.
Which brings us to step 4, the pivot point.
This is the objective measurement. When Traveler A wakes up and looks ahead, they observe that Traveler B, the one who kept moving, is now farther ahead than they expected. The gap is real. Traveler B is X distance ahead of Traveler A. This is the unvarnished fact, the data point delivered to the central nervous system.
Okay, and the immediate physical response, which is still objective action at this stage, that's step 5. Traveler A pushes harder. They exert focused effort, motivated purely by the desire to close that gap. They catch up, maybe even get slightly ahead for a moment because of that burst of effort, and then what? They rest again. They've achieved proximity.
And finally, step 6. The cycle repeats endlessly. Every single time Traveler A takes a break, every time they wake up, they discover they have fallen behind again. The overall physical pattern is just strictly defined, alternating phases of synchronized effort, then rest, then observing a deficit, then a catch-up effort, and then back to rest.
What needs to, I think, really sink in deeply for you listening is that these 6 steps represent the same facts and the same timeline for both the version of the story where the traveler feels like an empowered success and the version where they feel like a hopeless failure. The objective movement is identical.
The path itself, then, is just a mechanism for producing relative motion. That's all it is. The objective physical truth is simply we are moving forward, and sometimes one of us is further ahead than the other.
And the staggering difference.
The staggering difference between the two realities is found entirely in the milliseconds between traveler waking up and assigning meaning to that observed distance. That interpretive filter is the difference between a neutral data point and an emotional catastrophe.
So we've established the constant facts. Now we enter reality 1. And this is, I think, for many of us, the default setting. It's that highly competitive, comparison-driven narrative that is just constantly reinforced by our culture. Think social media comparison syndrome applied to, well, everything. Careers, personal fitness, you name it. Traveler A wakes up, observes the distance, and the internal system kicks in with its interpretation. And the internal narrative created by this first interpretation is it's deeply personal, it's simple, and it's utterly brutal. It's no matter how hard I try, no matter how much sustained effort I put in, I'm always behind when it matters. I am fundamentally incapable of keeping up. I can never, ever catch up for good.
And that narrative launches what the source terms the perceived deficit rendering loop. And I know that sounds like incredibly dense jargon, but we need to break it down because it's the key piece of code we're trying to debug here.
Wait, before we go deeper, I have to stop you. Perceived deficit rendering loop. That sounds like something out of a patent application. For the listener, what is that functionally in plain English? Is this just a fancy term for being a pessimist?
That's a fair challenge, a really fair challenge, and it's why we need to unpack the precision in that term. It's actually much more destructive than simple pessimism. It's a systemic malfunction. So think of it this way. A rendering loop is just the process your psyche uses to generate your subjective reality from objective data. It's the filter that gets applied to the lens of your perception.
Okay, the filter.
Right. And when we call it the perceived deficit rendering loop, we are specifying the filter's function. The filter takes neutral objective data, the physical distance, which is simply a measure of progress on the path, and it interprets that distance exclusively as evidence of personal inadequacy.
A failure.
Of failure, of losing the race. It takes a neutral fact and turns it into a moral judgment against the self.
So the distance itself isn't the failure. The interpretation renders the mere existence of that distance as proof of my insufficient effort or some inherent flaw in me.
Exactly. It weaponizes rest against you.
Wow.
The movement itself, Traveler B moving forward, that's not the problem. In fact, it's good. The path is being cleared. But the interpreter, this buggy filter, it warps that neutral data into a deficit relative to the self. It's a psychological bug that screams, your rest must mean you failed, rather than your rest was necessary recovery.
Okay, let's ground this in a modern career example. You take a necessary mental health break, maybe a week off. You come back, you check the industry news, and you see a former colleague or a peer just landed a massive promotion or launched their IPO or wrote a successful book. The objective data is simple. They moved ahead. But that perceived deficit loop, It just screams, I am insufficient, my brake was a mistake, and I'm doomed to lag behind forever.
And here's the loop part of it. That output, that crushing feeling of inadequacy, the shame, it immediately becomes the input for the next round of decisions.
Oh, that's nasty.
It is. The feeling of inadequacy drives the subsequent behavior, which in this reality is frantic, unsustainable effort, catch-up mode. This leads to burnout, which then just confirms the initial negative story. See, I failed because I'm exhausted. And that reinforces the loop. It's a closed system of emotional self-sabotage, completely independent of the physical reality of the path.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? This simple internal story transforms the objective experience of just walking on a path into this complex, draining psychological reality. Let's look closely at the precise negative states, the source details, because these really define the daily life of Traveler A. The first state is just crippling anxiety. Because Traveler A interprets a distance as doom, they are constantly hyper-aware of the gap widening. They can never really relax during the rest period. They're haunted by the thought, how much farther are they getting right now? This anxiety just poisons the recovery process itself.
And that anxiety is coupled with this profound shame. Traveler A interprets the need to rest, which is a biological necessity, as a flaw, a personal weakness compared to this perpetually moving, seemingly flawless Traveler B.
Their internal monologue is probably something like, I'm lazy, I'm not disciplined enough. If I were stronger, I wouldn't need to stop.
Right, and that shame leads directly to this crushing sense of urgency. Since rest equals failure in this model, Traveler A abandons any kind of sustainable pacing for these frantic bursts of effort. They don't walk, they sprint until they crash.
They're operating in a perpetual state of red alert.
Totally. They over-optimize, they try to squeeze every last second of performance out of their system, which ironically leads to really poor strategic decisions.
And the cumulative, predictable result of all of this cognitive and emotional stress is what?
Profound systemic exhaustion. And this is a really crucial distinction. Traveler A and Traveler B have exerted the exact same number of physical calories to cover the same distance. But in version 1, the narrative filter takes that objective physical tiredness and turns it into psychological exhaustion rooted in moral failure and shame.
It's a weariness that sleep can't fix.
It can't, because the fatigue is cognitive, not caloric. Your body's tired, but your mind is just drained because it's constantly processing threat signals that aren't actually real.
That's a critical insight. Okay, let's connect that individual emotional state to the deeper systemic consequences. Insight from the source. What happens when this perceived deficit loop is the dominant operating system for a long, long time?
Well, the first and most obvious consequence is that pervasive combination of fatigue and a deep-seated fear of failure. Since every rest period just confirms to the system that you're falling behind, rest itself becomes an unproductive, anxiety-inducing luxury.
So you start avoiding it.
You start avoiding necessary recovery time, which just ensures you perform far worse during the next effort phase. It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure.
And second, the system becomes defined entirely by hypervigilance and competition. Traveler B is no longer a fellow traveler whose movement might be benefiting the whole environment. They are the adversary, the benchmark, the constant source of your pain.
All of Traveler A's energy shifts from the actual goal moving forward on the path to the obsessive, costly monitoring of that gap.
Okay, this is where we get into the really dense terminology from the source. The critical risk is what the source calls collapse risk, or S over dominance.
Yes.
All right, let's pause and drill down on S over dominance. That sounds like a medical diagnosis. What are S and B, and why does S over dominance lead to system collapse? Give us an analogy we can grab onto.
Absolutely. The source uses S and B to describe two fundamental energetic states of any living system. S stands for strain or survival mode. It's the energy driven by fear, by scarcity, competition, and urgency. B stands for benefit or building mode. This is the energy driven by trust, cooperation, abundance, and sustainable contribution. So S over dominance just means your internal operating system is dominated by S energy. Every step is interpreted as a fight for survival. If you are constantly focused on the threat Traveler B, getting ahead, and on scarcity, not enough time, not enough energy, not enough innate ability, your system is perpetually in fight or flight.
So my brain is constantly screaming, catch up, you're failing. I'm in S over dominance.
Precisely. And this leads inevitably to collapse risk. Why? Because that survival energy, S energy, is designed for short-term sprints, escaping a predator, putting out an emergency fire.
It's not for the long haul.
It is not designed for sustained strategic movement over an indefinite path. When a system is dominated by S energy, it forces itself to run hot, interpreting every single data point as an existential threat. You burn through your resources because the emotional interpretation of the walk requires more energy than the physical act of walking itself.
It's just tragic, isn't it? The interpretive choice, just seeing that distance as a deficit, has actually determined the structural fate of the system. The path itself might go on forever, but the traveler running that perceived deficit loop, they will hit a wall. They're structurally, internally set up for burnout.
They're expending cognitive and emotional resources on fighting the path that they could be using for walking the path.
The energy drain from constantly fighting an external reality, which we have to keep reminding ourselves is entirely neutral and unconcerned with them, is the definition of self-imposed pressure.
And it guarantees collapse. It guarantees failure. Not because the traveler is physically weak, but because their internal narrative forces them to waste all their power on existential fear. The entire reality of version 1 is the outcome of a single, deeply destructive cognitive filter.
Okay, now for the pivot, the transformation. And honestly, the most challenging part of this entire deep dive. This requires you, listening, to do a mental reset. We're going to replay the exact same sequence of images from the first section. Two figures, same path. One rests, wakes up, and sees the other farther ahead. Traveler B is still X distance ahead of Traveler A. The physical movement is 100% identical. The objective facts are absolutely locked.
And here's the point of leverage. The only thing that changes is the meaning assigned to that data point, to that distance.
The new internal dialogue, when Traveler A wakes up and sees Traveler B farther ahead, is one of profound relief, of trust, of gratitude. The interpretation shifts from deficit to contribution. They were clearing the path for me.
That simple phrase is a cognitive miracle. It reframes the other person's motion from a competitive threat, a source of S energy, into a contribution of mutual benefit. It immediately activates B energy.
The objective distance is still there.
It's still there, but now it's evidence of support, of shared momentum, of a collective win. It's not evidence of scarcity or personal failure anymore. The perceived deficit, which was the entire foundation of Reality 1, just vanishes completely.
And the change is instantaneous. The system relaxes. The fight-or-flight response is disarmed. The anxiety and the shame are just released.
And that physiological shift immediately changes the resting person's physical experience and their subsequent efficiency. In version 1, waking up led to a frantic burst of stressed, shame-driven, inefficient effort.
Right.
In version 2, the resulting action is powerful, efficient, and it's rooted in trust. Let's detail the new experience and the actions that flow from this cooperative mindset. Traveler A stands up and immediately encounters less resistance.
Why? Why less resistance?
Because Traveler B wasn't racing to beat them. In this narrative, Traveler B was performing the hard initial work of dealing with the friction of the unknown. They were clearing fallen branches, finding the most efficient route, setting a sustainable pace. Traveler A gets to benefit from the pioneering effort of Traveler B.
So because of that reduced resistance, Traveler A moves faster than before, catching up with relative ease. The forward motion isn't a struggle against a deficit anymore. It's a naturally efficient use of momentum that was gifted by the shared effort.
They're running downhill on a path that was just cleared for them.
It's beautiful.
And this is the critical behavioral difference.
Yeah.
Once they catch up, they don't just rest immediately because they're exhausted from catch-up mode. No. They take their turn, clearing the path, doing the hard work. They contribute to the shared momentum. The hard work is seen not as this miserable necessity, but as a reciprocal act of contribution.
They're setting up Traveler B for easier movement on the next cycle.
Precisely. And then, importantly, they rest again without shame, allowing the other to contribute. They rest knowing that the forward motion will be sustained by Traveler B's next burst of effort, not at their expense.
The source really emphasizes this cyclical, alternating nature. Forward motion, clearing the path, alternates equally and deliberately, with rest, recovering, and letting the other contribute. It's a beautifully choreographed dance of mutual respect.
This is the difference between a constant competitive sprint and a regenerative relay race. The internal story here is transformed from scarcity to synergy. We are building the future together.
And this narrative is the foundation of the second mechanism, the cooperative rendering loop.
Right. The function of this loop is a complete inversion of the perceived deficit model. The system perceives the same widening distance not as a sign of failure, but as proof of mutual support, as proof of shared effort and collective progress.
So the distance isn't a metric of how far behind I am. It's a metric of how much shared ground we have now secured.
It's a fundamental shift in your mental calculus. When you interpret the other person's success or achievement as a shared asset, when you truly believe that their progress is serving your collective ability to move forward, your system relaxes. The burden of perfection and endless individual effort is distributed across the whole team, freeing up all those cognitive and emotional resources that were previously wasted on anxiety, fear, and shame.
Okay, so let's look at the systemic consequences of reality too, and contrast them sharply with that collapse risk we saw earlier. The shift from competitive stress to shared agency produces outputs that ensure sustainability. Where version 1 created fear and these exhausting sprints, version 2 yields profound trust and momentum. Trust because Traveler A knows Traveler B isn't a rival, but a partner whose forward movement actually guarantees their own easier progress in the future.
And momentum, because Traveler A is no longer spending effort overcoming all these self-imposed mental blocks. They're simply walking on a path that has already been made efficient for them.
And the shift away from hypervigilance and competition is the development of genuine cooperation and shared agency.
The travelers become a synergistic unit. They're achieving significantly more together than they could possibly achieve in isolation, even though, and we have to keep saying this, their individual physical output remains identical to the frantic, solo sprints of version 1. The systemic performance dramatically improves, even if the individual effort input is the same.
And instead of those frantic, unsustainable bursts of S-dominated effort, we see regenerative pacing. Rest becomes a strategic contribution to long-term progress. It's not a moral failing to be hidden anymore.
The system understands that recovery is a vital, non-negotiable step in the process, equivalent in value to the clearing of the path.
And this brings us back to the critical systemic benefit, which is the direct opposite of S over dominance. It's coherence, balanced SB.
Exactly.
So if S is the strain or survival energy, and B is the benefit or building energy, what does coherence mean, practically? How do I know if my system is running coherently?
You know it because the strain, the S part, is accepted as necessary for the building, the B part. In coherence, the hard work of clearing the path, S, is balanced by the immediate reward of rest and shared progress. B, the effort is perceived as shared, as cyclical, and as meaningful. A coherent system is running efficiently. It's maximizing forward movement while minimizing internal friction and psychological waste.
Unsustainable system.
In reality, too, Traveler A doesn't interpret their rest as failure, S. They interpret it as preparation for their next high-impact effort, B. They are trusting Traveler B to cover the S phase, which allows Traveler A to enter the B phase of recovery. That is the essence of a balanced, sustainable system.
The quality of life is just night and day. Traveler A in version 2, despite walking the exact same distance and feeling the same physical exertion, experiences dramatically less psychological stress, greater emotional resilience, and a much longer, more successful journey than their shame-driven counterpart in version 1.
The physical trajectory is identical, but the internal geometry of experience, the subjective reality, is fundamentally different because of one choice, a choice made about the meaning of distance.
And this brings us to the core realization that underpins this entire deep dive. We've established conclusively, I think, that the external facts, the path, the distance, the objective action sequence, didn't change. Only the story changed. But the profound and life-altering impact is this. When that story changes, when that internal narrative shifts from seeing distance as competition to seeing it as contribution, our feelings, our beliefs, and even our fundamental sense of identity change right along with it. This is why the source insists that two realities were created. These are not just two different moods. They are two distinct, internally generated worlds built entirely upon the same external blueprint.
To give this conceptual architecture the precision it needs, the source introduces some terminology that's rooted in the Ma'at framework. That's the ancient Egyptian concept of truth, order, cosmic balance. And this framework helps us isolate the true points of leverage in our lives.
Okay, we're getting deep into the source language here, so let's make sure we ground these terms immediately. Tell me simply, what are the two core concepts we absolutely need to understand?
We need to distinguish between the constant and the variable. First, we have the rendered geometry.
Okay.
This is the physical path itself, the measurable, observable, external fact. It's the quantifiable distance, the timeline, the physical effort you exerted. In other analogies, it's the spreadsheet of your company's sales figures. It's the number on the scale that tells you your weight. It is constant,
Raw data.
pure raw data. Second, and this is the variable, we have the meaning vector, B. Think of B as the directional arrow of interpretation, the filter settings on your operating system.
So if the rendered geometry is the raw data file, B is the program I use to open and read that file. And that program determines whether the output is colored red for deficit or green for support.
That's a perfect analogy. In reality 1, the B points toward deficit, competition, and S energy. The interpretation colors the raw data red. In reality 2, the B points toward cooperation, shared asset, and B energy. The interpretation colors the exact same raw data green.
That's it. That's the whole game.
This vector, this B, is the single point of leverage that changes everything. It's the invisible force that directs your emotional and cognitive state. Your internal narrative takes the neutral data of the rendered geometry, the distance, and it runs it through the meaning vector, which then determines whether the entire experience becomes one of strain or support.
And we know the consequence of that choice. Strain leads to S over dominance, burnout, and collapse risk. Support leads to coherence, that balanced SB, a regenerative, sustainable pacing. The conclusion is just inescapable. Two realities are created not by external difference, but by narrative interpretation driven by that B.
This removes agency from the external world and places it squarely in our cognitive choice.
The beauty is that you don't need the path to change to feel better. You need the story about the path to change.
In this metaphor, it captures a deep principle that applies far beyond just walking a trail.
So let's broaden this out. How does this illuminate concepts across personal development, system design, all the things referenced in the source?
Well, first, there's the idea that meaning changes physics. And again, this isn't literal quantum physics. It's the subjective internal physics of effort and pain. The rendered geometry, the measurable physical effort is the same, but the meaning attached to that effort determines whether your body perceives it as painful, unnecessary strain, that's version 1, or as powerful, necessary contribution, that's version 2. The perception of pain is modulated entirely by your B.
I'm thinking about that moment in a marathon when you hit the wall, your legs objectively hurt. If your B is set to deficit, you interpret that pain as, I'm failing, I can't finish, and you stop. But if your B is set to contribution, you might interpret that same pain as, this is the cost of my growth, and the community waiting for me at the finish line needs my effort, and you continue. The objective pain is the same, but the resulting action and your identity are completely different.
Exactly. The meaning shifts the outcome of the physics. Second, we see how narrative shapes the internal geometry of experience. Your internal geometry is your cognitive landscape, the way your brain organizes inputs, memories, priorities.
So in reality 1, the internal geometry is jagged. It's filled with mental obstacles, competitive silos, psychological friction. Every action requires overcoming some kind of internal resistance. It's like having a mental roadmap where all the lines are squiggly and colored danger.
Precisely. In reality, too, the internal geometry becomes smooth, cooperative, and conducive to efficient movement. The internal map changes, making strategic rest and synchronized effort feel natural, even though the external landscape of the path is identical.
And
finally, the observation that identity shifts depending on how we interpret motion, not on the motion itself. The identity of traveler A, in reality 1, is defined by the narrative of being a loser, an insufficient competitor perpetually playing catch-up. That shame becomes their identity.
And the instant the B shifts, the identity shifts with it. The traveler becomes a contributor, a cooperative partner, a strategic pace setter. The shift happens when you choose to see the other person's progress not as a slight against you, but as a gift to the collective, a service rendered to make your future movement easier.
The synthesis is just so powerful. The idea that you now possess the knowledge that the same facts, the same timeline, and the same events can be lived out as two completely different emotional realities. The difference between success and collapse, anxiety and momentum, is rooted entirely in the cognitive choice of your meaning vector, your B.
You have agency over that lens. We have to be clear, this isn't just think positive. This is a structural choice about how you process external data. It's the difference between self-sabotage and systemic efficiency.
It's the highest form of self-control. You are controlling the filter through which reality is perceived, and by doing so, you are controlling the structural capacity of your system to sustain effort over the long term.
So this deep dive has shown us that true agency is, well, it's never about controlling external variables, the speed of the other traveler, the difficulty of the path, or the objective facts of relative distance. It's about controlling your interpretive framework, your meaning vector,
Sure.
your E. Just a quick recap of the mechanism. We have the perceived deficit loop, which takes neutral data, like distance, and renders it as shame and fear, inevitably leading to S overdominance and system collapse.
And on the other side?
And we have the cooperative loop, which takes the exact same data and renders it as mutual support and collective progress, leading to coherence, that balanced SB, and regenerative, sustainable pacing. The powerful realization for you, the listener, is that you have immediate, total agency over your meaning vector, B, even if you cannot change the rendered geometry, the objective path you're currently on. The moment you decide to view distance as contribution rather than competition, your system instantly switches from a state of strain to a state of support.
That pivot is available every morning when you wake up.
Every single time.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the next time you feel that intense fatigue, that flash of anxiety, or that wave of shame because a peer, a competitor, someone in your field is objectively ahead of you, just stop the loop before it renders the deficit. Ask yourself a powerful, clarifying question. Is this objective distance a measure of my insufficiency, or is my system just interpreting their forward motion as competition instead of contribution?
What would it feel like?
What would it feel like, functionally and physically, if you truly believed they were simply clearing the path for you, that they were doing the hard, resistant, pioneering work so that your next steps could be faster and smoother when your turn comes? This raises a really important question. The gap isn't always evidence of your deficit. Sometimes it's irrefutable evidence of the collective path being made easier by shared devotion. That shift is available to you right now without changing a single step you take tomorrow.